Ladies and gentlemen, ambassadors and friends, welcome to the 2020 Caledonian Lecture, hosted tonight at St Columba's Church of Scotland in Pont Street, London, but broadcast primarily from north of the border from the home of our speaker, Mary Miller. Our subject is Jane Haining, a Scot whose life became inextricably linked with the Hungarian schoolgirls and colleagues with whom she lived and eventually died. While her story is forged by the obscenities of war, and specifically the Holocaust, her story is also a beautiful counter to such horror. A story that crosses the barriers of language, culture, and faith. It's fitting, therefore, that we begin this evening with music. For music, with its ability to transcend borders and touch the parts that words often cannot reach. It's fitting that our two musicians, both members of the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, Hungarian Adam Roma and Scot Kirsty Lovey, fitting that they open proceedings tonight with a program of music reflecting some of the places and themes that we will hear about from Mary Miller's talk. Details of the pieces played and the full biographies of Adam and Kirsty are on the website. Adam and Kirsty, welcome to St Columba's, and thank you for leading us on a musical journey that will honor Jane Haining. Ladies and gentlemen, ambassadors, friends, from wherever you are tuning in, Ealing or Edinburgh, Dagenham or Dunvegan, welcome to the 10th annual Caledonian Lecture. Each year, our guest speaker is asked to educate and to celebrate the life of an outstanding Scot whose contribution was made largely out with the country of birth. The previous 9 have been hosted by London's Caledonian Club. But given the subject matter of today's lecture, the faith-inspired and faithful work of the Church of Scotland's Jane Haining, I am delighted that St Columba's Pont Street, one of 2 London Church of Scotland congregations, can play host on this occasion. In 2018, 10 of London's Scottish organisations collaborated extensively to mark the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. From those Scots in Great War London events has grown the fledgling Scots in London Association, a now expanded collaboration of charities, clubs, congregations and businesses who seek to enhance and promote the contribution that Scots continue to make in this most diverse and fast-paced capital city. Under the patronage of the Princess Royal, today is the first event under the Scots in London banner. We hope the first of many. And a message from our patron is accessible on the church website. The real driving force behind this year's Caledonian Lecture is the lecture series founder, Mr. David Coftree. Undismayed by the slings and arrows of COVID's misfortunes, David has not relented. And though not as originally envisaged, with a live audience and hospitality to follow, that we have a lecture at all is down to David and those who have offered support. Among them, His Excellency Dr. Ferenc Kumin, Hungarian Ambassador to the United Kingdom, and Her Majesty's Ambassador to Hungary, Ian Lindsay. We will hear from both of them later. I'd also like to thank Mr. Mate Vincenț, head of the Hungarian Cultural Institute, who arranged our musicians, Mr. David Bolden, the Caledonian Club Secretary and his staff, and from St Columba's, Mrs. Lucy Llewellyn and Mr. Hugh Pym. And finally, Mr. Richard Jolly, who has overseen the technical side of our recorded and streamed event today. We are extremely grateful to everyone involved. Via the magic and mystery of Zoom and live stream recording, today's presentation comes to you. So now to our lecturer and our lecture. Mary Miller studied modern languages at Oxford and then qualified in Edinburgh as a medical social worker. With her husband John, a former moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, she brought up 3 children in a Glasgow housing scheme and worked with other parents there to improve facilities for children. In the 1990s, she worked as a peace monitor in South Africa, and from 2007 to 2012 worked in child health care in Zimbabwe. She was named Evening Times International Scotswoman of the Year in 2009. Her lifelong interest in the care of children drew her to explore Jane Haining's devotion to the Jewish children in her care. Mary is author of the celebrated Jane Haining, A Life of Love and Courage. Jane's tale of love, faith and courage in time of prejudice and fear is timely and inspiring. Mary, on behalf of Scots in London and the Hungarian Embassy, I am really delighted to invite you to give it, albeit remotely, the 2020 Caledonian Lecture.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Angus, for your introduction, and many thanks to the Caledonian Club for inviting me to deliver the Caledonian Lecture for this year. I'd also like to thank especially David Coftree for overcoming all the interminable challenges in planning this year's lecture. And I'd like to thank Lucy Llewellyn and Hugh and Richard, whose technical expertise has made it possible to deliver this lecture tonight. I'm delighted that this year the club has chosen to honour Jane Haining, a true Scottish heroine who I think deserves to be better known than she has been up till now in her own country. And of course, it's particularly appropriate and a particular pleasure that we have the Hungarian ambassador to the UK, Dr. Ferenc Kumin, with us tonight, and also the UK ambassador to Hungary. I've realised that there's been a particular affinity between Scots and Hungarians over many centuries, and I benefited from it myself when I went to Budapest to research the life of Jane Haining, and found myself welcomed, helped, and encountering a shared enthusiasm everywhere, which I think speaks volumes about the connections and about the esteem in which Jane Haining is held in Hungary. It's an esteem that was certainly mutual, and I recall that a contemporary of Jane Haining's who visited her in Budapest said of her, "She was a fine example of the Scot abroad, the most Scottish thing in the Scottish mission, with her sonsy face and cheery smile and unmistakable accent, and yet so completely at home in Hungary that you wondered which country she loved the more." So I'm going to tell you something of the life of Jane Haining, and I'm also going to use pictures because I think you'll probably agree that a picture can be worth 1,000 words. Jane Haining was a modest person who lived a life that, if it wasn't for the terrible times she lived in, would have been obscure except to those who knew her. And yet it was a very significant life, and indeed, I think, of great relevance to the times we're living in today. There'll be few people watching tonight who haven't experienced this year, if not before, the sense of living under an approaching cloud of menace and danger, and of what that means for what we love and for daily life. From the time I started to write about Jane Haining, I've been haunted by a verse from the old Scots ballad of Mary Hamilton. "Oh, little did my mither ken the day she cradled me, the lands I was to travel in, or the death I was to die." When I was asked to write a book about Jane Haining by an Edinburgh publisher, the only thing I knew about her was that she had worked for the Church of Scotland, devoted herself to the Jewish girls in her care in Budapest in the 1930s and 40s, and refused to leave them in their hour of greatest need. She's quoted as having said then, "If these girls needed me in days of sunshine, they will need me much more in days of darkness." And that stayed in my memory because I've worked for most of my life with children in difficult situations and have had to ponder dilemmas of that kind. The story of Jane Haining's life also highlights, I think, the beliefs and principles in the Scotland of her day and of her community that underpinned her life. And our beliefs and principles are most usually formed in childhood. So let me start with her parents. Thomas Haining and Jane Matheson were both from small farming families, hardworking, not wealthy, but reasonably secure in rural Dumfriesshire. They married when they were both 23 and had 2 daughters and twin sons who sadly died in infancy. In 1897, they moved into Lochenhead farmhouse outside the village of Dunsker in Dumfriesshire, and Jane was born there on the 6th of June, actually in the top bedroom behind the window on the left. We can imagine her playing with her older sisters around the steading, helping with the many chores of the farm. She was said as a toddler to be very close to her mother, but when Jane was 5, her mother was pregnant again, and a new baby daughter, Helen, was born that July. Sadly, Jane Sr. died 3 weeks after the birth. Little Jane started at Dunsker Village School shortly after her mother's death, and you can see her in the front row. There's a little group of 4 small girls in white pinnies, and Jane is the one on the right of the 4. Very sadly, baby Helen too died after 18 months, and Jane thereafter displayed a lifelong need to mother and defend young girls. So here's the Haining family around 1905, with Jane on the left beside her dad, her oldest sister Alison standing, and Margaret, the middle daughter, on the right. Thomas Haining, as perhaps you can see in the picture, was an elder in the United Free Presbyterian Church in Dunsker, which upheld quite a strict tradition of discipline, duty, and responsibility. Further back in the family was an ancestor who, as an 18-year-old girl, had been one of the Wigtown martyrs. She was tied to a stake in the Solway and slowly drowned by the incoming tide for refusing to take an oath acknowledging the king as head of the church. The Presbyterian Church acknowledged no king but Jesus Christ. So it was instilled into Jane Haining from an early age that no state authority came above the individual conscience. She was not brought up to be impressed by the Third Reich. It was also a community and a household where Bible knowledge would be taught to all children, and Jane acquired in particular a lifelong love of the Psalms. When she was 12, Jane won a bursary to Dumfries Academy, which was then the equivalent of the county grammar school for clever children from the farms round about. And we're told that she played games with zest, approached her schoolwork with a certain eagerness and ease, and was of a seldom jovial but happy disposition, with the characteristic dry humour of the countryside. She was one of the first pupils to stay during term time in a newly opened hostel for children from a distance, so she had first-hand experience of life in a girls' home, which she was later to make her career. And she apparently acquired a reputation for mothering other girls, including her older sister Margaret, who was not always best pleased. Jane was a very able pupil, and in her time at Dumfries Academy, she won 41 prizes and ended as dux of the school. On Sundays, the pupils from the hostel attended a Dumfries church where the minister, John Cairns, was convener of a Church of Scotland International Relations Committee with responsibilities throughout the British Empire. So she acquired from an early age an international awareness and a sense of what was going on in the world beyond Dumfries. Then, 1914, Jane's last year at school, World War I broke out and changed life even in rural Scotland forever. Dunsker at that time had a population of about 200, and on the First World War memorial in the village, there are 40 names, all of whom and whose families Jane must have known or known of. Among the many consequences of that war was the simple one that young women like Jane and her sisters, seen here on the brink of adulthood, were left with no one to marry. And so Jane didn't go back to stay on the farm. Instead, she became one of the first career girls. With her school success behind her, she went off to Glasgow to the newly opened commercial college, where she took and easily passed a business course. She then got a job with J&P Coats, the giant Paisley thread firm, which at that time was the third biggest company in the world and employed 12,000 people in Paisley alone. Some people think that Jane Haining was a mill girl, but in fact she wasn't. With her business qualification, she entered Coats as a wages clerkess and worked in the counting house, the financial and administrative centre of the company. Again, her ability quickly showed through, and during her time at Coats, she rose through the ranks to become eventually what I think we would now call the PA to the financial director, his right-hand woman whom he valued most highly. Jane's social and leisure time in Glasgow centred on Queen's Park United Free Church, where she became a Sunday school teacher and youth leader. Her minister there, the Reverend J.L. Craig, later said of her, "No one who really knew her could have any doubt of the depth and sincerity of her Christian faith, although she made no ostentatious parade of it. She did not speak effusively of her religious experience. She observed the traditional Scottish reticence in regard to her deepest thoughts and feelings." That made her actually quite difficult to write about, and in wondering about Jane's inner life, we often have to depend mostly on the decisions she took and what she actually did, as well as what other people said about her. We know that at Queen's Park she was devoted to children, including the most disadvantaged, and as well as her Sunday duties, would often take some of them out on Saturdays for picnics in the park, or in her digs if it was raining. We know she was generous because one former child recalled that she would buy them tuppenny halfpenny cream buns from city bakeries, and, quote, "she always paid for everything herself." She also helped out at meetings of the Band of Hope in the poorest areas of Glasgow, devoted to persuading vulnerable children to sign the pledge against drinking alcohol. We see in her life in Glasgow that she was perhaps conservative, with a small c, in her attitude to politics. For example, she didn't involve herself with the rent strikes led by women that were going on in Glasgow at that time, and she doesn't appear to have been a suffragette. Her preferred style of action was in direct care for individuals, to whom she devoted herself, as William Blake would say, in minute particulars. By the time she was 30, Jane had become restless in her office job at J&P Coates, and around that time, she took the decision to leave and pursue what she had come to see as her calling. She wrote to a cousin about how it happened. And here are Jane's own words. "I'm afraid it was almost as big a surprise to me as anyone to find myself appointed to a missionary post. It really came about in a most natural way in the world. Do you remember when you visited Glasgow that I said it was my ambition sometime in life to have charge of a home for girls? Well, when the time to decide came, I resigned my post in Paisley to the horror and dismay of almost all my friends, and took a course of domestic training in the Domestic Science College in Glasgow. A short time after I finished my course, I saw this post," she was by then in Budapest, "advertised in our church magazine and applied. From the very first, everything went smoothly, and I found myself appointed almost before I could believe it myself. So you see, I approached not from the missionary side, but from the girls' home side." I think it's notable that although Jane is often now carelessly described as a missionary, that is not actually how she described herself. And here's a photo of Jane published in a Church of Scotland newsletter in 1932, alongside an article reporting her appointment as matron of the girls' home at the Scottish Jewish Mission School in Budapest. And off she went, on the night train, as it happens, from Waverley Station in Edinburgh. Budapest, at that time, was one of the great European capitals of the early 20th century, rivaling Vienna and Paris with its cafe society and cultural elite. Jane was keenly interested in all that was going on, but she would also have been very much aware that there was also a dark underside of poverty in the city. Jane arrived during the Great Depression in a society that had been turned upside down by World War I and the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. By the end of that war, Hungary had lost 2/3 of its territory, and 2/3 of its population had been deprived of their nationality. The need to restore these losses was a prime driver of Hungarian foreign policy for the next 20 years, and in the eyes of many, drove Hungary into an alliance with Hitler. So enormous tensions underlay Hungarian society. This is the former Scottish Mission building in Budapest, still standing in Vörösmarty Street. And when Jane arrived, it housed a church, the Hungarian offices of the Scottish Bible Society, and a host of other activities for all ages: social, educational, cultural, philanthropic. But the jewel in its crown was the Scottish school. The Scottish school had been founded in the 19th century with the purpose of educating Christian and Jewish girls together to build relationships, learn from each other, and respect each other's cultures. When Jane arrived, this lady, Margaret Prem, had been the headmistress since 1905, when she had been appointed at the age of 22. She was to become Jane Haining's closest colleague and greatest friend. Margaret Prem was at the forefront of developing education for girls, and under her leadership, the school became well known for its high-quality, modern education. Places were much sought after for girls of well-to-do families as well as for poor. And here we see the modern education, gym class for girls, elementary school class. And as well as Margaret Prem, Jane found herself with wonderful colleagues and friends among the Hungarian teachers. Jane would have been the first to say that everything she achieved in the school was a team effort. And some of her colleagues, including the three I show there, whose names I know and are mentioned in the book, but I can't do justice to them now, were to prove as courageous and dedicated in the terrible times that lay ahead as Jane herself. I know that this picture shows us 1 o'clock outside the Scottish school because these words are written on the back in Jane's handwriting. Jane's job was as the matron in charge of the girls who boarded at the school. And at 1 o'clock each day, the day girls went home and Jane and the boarders stayed to live their family life in the girls' home. It was part of Jane's job to encourage children towards Christian belief, and she sought to do that, always by example and by direct involvement in the practicalities of day-to-day life, more than by preaching. And a former pupil reminds us, quote, "The Scottish school did not try to convert Jews. You could keep your own religion. There was a rabbi for the Jewish children. You also learned a lot about the Protestant religion and the Catholic religion." I do wonder if a bit of West of Scotland teaching had crept in there. And so you had a broader view. You were not so narrow in your own religion, and I think that was wonderful. So Jane Haining had arrived at a school that suited her talents and her temperament, and she was happy there from the first, in what she called her days of sunshine. Here she is with the girls on a summer holiday at Lake Balaton. One of the things the girls loved about her was that she always joined in activities with them. And here she is in her swimsuit behind the boat. Another holiday one. And back in Budapest too, the girls went on outings and visits that were part of their broad and outgoing education. And a friend from these years tells us that Jane, far from being a dour or dogmatic missionary, was, quote, "a smiling, happy, natural woman who showed the deep meaning of her faith in her daily life rather than in words. She was very understanding and tolerant, though we differed in many respects. I smoked and used bad language, but never succeeded in shocking Jane or being scolded by her." Many accounts have been collected by former pupils of their years in the girls' home with Miss Haining. We see clearly that Jane was strict with them, which she no doubt regarded as her duty. Girls recall a strict requirement to wash thoroughly, including their feet, before going to bed, and sometimes there were inspections, and being required always to clean their plates at meal times. They agree, however, that the strictness was appreciated, and there are many more stories of how they knew that Miss Haining loved them. How, if they were ill, she would take them into her own room at night. How she had the knack of making each one feel special. How she knew their individual needs and devoted herself to them. She was also, it is clear, great fun and organised beautifully designed parties and celebrations on every possible occasion. Jane and the girls' home excelled at the ceremonies of innocence. But the days of sunshine were not to last. By 1938, the clouds on the horizon had become a storm, and the focus of the school had had to sharpen. George Knight, the minister then in charge of the mission, wrote, "The specific object of the school is to educate Jews and Christians together in order to fight the anti-Semitism that is endemic, not just in Hungary, but in all of Eastern Europe." He and his colleagues spoke out passionately against anti-Semitism. This increasingly annoyed the right-wing press and the growing Hungarian fascist party, the Arrow Cross. They recruited informers among the staff of the mission, and at one point burst in and threatened Knight with arrest using insider information. Following this incident, Margaret Prem wrote a strongly worded memo to all the staff at the Scottish school. She said, "Anyone who comes to work in this organisation is clearly and precisely informed as to what the job is and what responsibility it entails. It is not a secret that this institution is a Jewish mission and that most of our pupils are Jewish. The management, of which Jane Haining was a key part, reminds everyone that anyone who sympathises with xenophobic views cannot work here." And at Christmas 1938, Jane wrote home, "The proposed new Jewish laws seem to stand like the angel with the flaming sword, barring even the avenues of thought to pleasanter days. Before their eyes, the Jews see and hear what is happening in Germany, and know not the hour when Hungary may follow her inhuman example, there being abundant evidence of the possibility of her doing so." Jane's time was increasingly taken up with counselling desperate Jewish parents who sought some protection for their daughters by enrolling them in the Scottish school, and the girls' home was full to capacity. By the summer of 1939, Jane was very tired and took home leave. Margaret Prem accompanied her, and they visited Jane's remaining family in Dunsker. There they are on the doorstep. Margaret Prem and Jane on the right, and Jane's young half-sister Agnes in the middle. However, they were still in Britain when war broke out, and at once Jane and Margaret hurried home, having a terrible journey across Europe. As it turned out, that had been Jane's last visit to Scotland. Sorry, just pause to clear my throat, Early in 1940, George Knight returned to Scotland with his wife and baby son. Jane's employers, the Church of Scotland, asked and then instructed her to leave also and get back to Scotland by whatever means she could, but she refused. Her friend Frances Lee remembers, "Personal safety and comfort didn't enter her mind. I can see her now. No, Frances, I am the only English-speaking person left on the staff of the mission. The Jews are now entering their most dangerous period. Nothing would induce me to desert them." So she continued her increasing labours, doing everything she could to make the mission run smoothly, ever tactful, gracious, and patient. Louis Nage, a young pastor from the Hungarian Reformed Church, who you see in the middle there with his baby daughter on his knee, became de facto in charge of the Scottish mission. And he, Margaret Prem and Jane Haining, three of them in the middle there, became the mission council, responsible for steering their community through the darkest of days. The mission increasingly abandoned any focus on dogma and the idea of conversion, and tried simply to save lives. Louis Nage suspended the requirement for any Jews seeking baptism to attend courses. If any felt that a baptismal certificate might be of some help to them, they were simply given it. Jane and her colleagues assisted and shared in numerous efforts to help Jews to emigrate and to conceal and protect Jewish families and Hungarian dissidents in the mission cellars and in safe houses in the city. You can see in that picture that Jane was thin and worn and her hair had turned white, but she stepped up to meet the demands. As well as caring for the frightened children and their families, she really took over the business side of the mission, in addition to her duties at the school, negotiated a loan to pay the staff, and maintained communications with Edinburgh as best she could. Louis Nage's wife recalls that at this time, Jane, whatever her inner fears, was seen as an example and an inspiration to her colleagues. She wrote, "There was a small incident during those years which so fully expressed for me the essence of Jane. One day, she stopped at the gate of the Scottish mission and pointed to the hills of Buddha, saying, 'I always stop here before I go in and say, I lift my eyes to the mountains, whence comes my help.' That touched me so deeply that whenever I was stepping in that gate, her sentence reverberated in my heart." And many of you will recognize that quote from Psalm 121, sometimes known as the Scottish Psalm. In January 1944, here are Jane Haining and Margaret Prem with a friend, standing bravely at the start of a year that neither of them survived. Hungary, under the old aristocratic Regent Horthy, was trying to change sides in the war, and on the 19th of March, the Germans marched into Budapest. This is the last photo we have of Jane Haining, sitting in the second row, third from the right, and the girls' home. Agnes Rostas, a child who saw Jane's arrest, is sitting at the right-hand end in the second row. Margaret Prem is in the centre, between Jane and Mrs. Kovacs, the housekeeper, whose son-in-law had been told off by Jane for stealing food intended for the girls, and who went to inform against her to the Gestapo. On the 25th of April, 2 German officers came to the Scottish mission and arrested Jane. Agnes Rostas, who saw her being taken away, was crying, and Jane called out to her, "Don't worry, I'll be home for lunch." She was at first taken to an interrogation centre on Buddha Hill and then to the city jail. She was faced with 8 charges, including listening to the BBC, having British visitors, weeping when told to sew yellow stars on the clothing of her Jewish children, and political activity. None of these activities had been against the law, and Jane freely admitted to them all, except the one about political activity. She said she had always been too busy to take part in politics, and indeed she had never been political. Perhaps that was to her detriment in these evil times. At any rate, her case was already decided. Our last glimpse of Jane in Budapest comes from one of her cellmates in the city prison. The cellmate tells how one evening Jane organised a fashion show among her fellow prisoners, persuading them to dress up in the strange collection of garments they had accumulated and parade up and down the cell while Jane delivered a commentary in fluent German that had them all in fits of laughter. The next day, the cell door was flung open at 5 a.m. and Jane was taken away. Her cellmates, and perhaps Jane herself, thought that as a foreigner and a church worker, she would be going to a better place, perhaps a work camp in Austria. Instead, she was put on a train to Auschwitz. You probably know more than enough about what happened at Auschwitz. When the prisoners who had survived the journey in the packed cattle trucks that had transported them arrived at the platform, they were divided into 2 lines. And here we see the line made up of women, mostly mothers, and children, older people, and the obviously infirm. That line went to the left and walked along the platform to the gas chambers and the crematoria. Their lives at Auschwitz lasted at most a few hours. Jane Haining was in the line that went to the right among those thought capable of work. And it is thought that as a Gestapo-designated political prisoner, and not a Jew, she was kept in the older Camp 1 at Auschwitz and not in Birkenau, the much larger camp. But we know nothing at all about what happened to Jane individually in the 2 months that she survived there. We do know that on the 15th of July, 1944, she wrote a letter to Margaret Prem. The letter is written on a form given out to some prisoners, probably again to Jane because of her political status. The front of it, on the left, contains an elaborate set of rules and regulations, all a complete fiction, designed presumably to try to cover up what was going on at Auschwitz and to keep potential deportees sufficiently calm to fail to resist being rounded up and transported. The letter itself had to be written in pencil and in German, and here it is in Jane's handwriting. She asks briefly if food could be sent. Then she asks how the girls' home is getting on with food for the girls. She says, "What are you thinking of doing with the flour, Margaret? What is upstairs is the best. You ought to sift through what is left. Have you used up the eggs too?" She inquires after Margaret Prem's family, especially her elderly aunt. And then at the end she says, "There's not much to tell about what is going on here. Even here on the road to heaven are mountains, further away than ours to be sure, but still." And so we glimpse her, even in Auschwitz, still lifting her eyes to the hills, from whence comes her help. She ends, "Now I send appropriate greetings to the whole family and kiss and embrace you, your loving Jean," being the name by which she was known by her family and close friends. 2 days later, she was taken to the gas chamber. Since she died, Jane has been memorialised in various ways. Here is her name on the Haining family gravestone in Iron Grey Churchyard, Dumfriesshire, with her parents, the twin brothers who died in infancy, baby Helen, and the rest of the family added in their turn. In Queen's Park Church in Glasgow, there are 2 stained glass windows in her memory. In Budapest, there are plaques from the Jewish community in the Scottish Church and in the Garden of Remembrance at the Great Synagogue, and a street is named after her along one of the quays of the Danube. There's a memorial centre too now in Dunsker Parish Church, created by the local community and well worth a visit. In 1998, a plaque inscribed with a certificate of honour from Yad Vashem in Jerusalem was presented by the Israeli ambassador and loaned by Jane Haining's family to be displayed in the St Manga Museum in Glasgow. It includes the words, "The Commission for the Designation of the Righteous, on the basis of evidence presented before it, has decided to honour Jane Haining, who during the Holocaust period in Europe risked her life to save persecuted Jews. The Commission has accorded her the Medal of the Righteous among the Nations. Her name shall be forever engraved on the honour wall of the Garden of the Righteous at Yad Vashem, Jerusalem." And here her name is on the wall. And this most recent memorial was designed and made in 2015 by pupils at Dumfries Academy at their own request, which I think would have meant a great deal to Jane. Let me leave you with 2 things. Firstly, what one of her former pupils wrote about her. Annette Lantos was a Jewish pupil at the Scottish school who escaped to America, where she re-met and married a boy from her own village in Hungary, who went on to become an American congressman. Together, they created a foundation for human rights and Holocaust education. Annette Lantos said, quote, Jane Haining was a light that shone in the darkness in the midst of the hatred and horrors of the Second World War and of the Holocaust. She was a person who reminded us of our humanity and what it means to be a human being when everybody seemed to have forgotten that. You were either the persecutor or the persecuted. Terror reigned everywhere. And Jane Haining was a safe point of light and love that none of us will ever forget. And a final image. After my book about Jane Haining was published, an elderly Hungarian Jewish lady living in London got in touch with me to share her memories of being a child in the girls' home with Jane Haining. She shared an unforgettable story that I hadn't heard before, remembering the day in 1944 when, following the Nazi occupation of Hungary, it was made compulsory for anyone Jewish to wear a yellow star on their clothes. This lady wrote to me, "Miss Haining sobbed. She walked with red eyes among us. I heard later that she had tried to refuse, quote, to mark those children who were to be sent to the slaughterhouse because of their religion," unquote. The Germans' reply was that if the order was disobeyed, they would close the entire boarding house. It was not Miss Haining herself who suggested it, but it was acting in her spirit and personality that, irrespective of their religion, every single boarder in the girls' home sewed a yellow star on their uniform. And that was how we left our building that day for our daily walk to Heroes Square and back, Jewish and Christian, hand in hand, as equals. Thank you very much for listening.
Mary, thank you for that insightful story of Jane Haining, a Scot, truly worthy of being commemorated as a subject of the Caledonian Lecture. I'm pleased to say I'm now been joined by our two ambassadors, and before I introduce His Excellency the Hungarian Ambassador to propose the vote of thanks, you have kindly agreed to answer a few questions, and have been many, but we've collated them into three. In your biography of Jane Haining, you write, "In our memorials, we make people who need them to be." And as an example, suggest people view Jane variously as a saint, old-fashioned schoolmistress, Holocaust victim, human rights champion, feminist, Christian martyr. If we remember Jane Haining, who do you think we need her to be?
Well, it's a good question. I've encountered, as I say, all these views of Jane Haining. I think who I need her to be and who I think she was is an ordinary person. She had no special powers of sainthood or supernatural connection, but she became extraordinary, I think, through her very special character, the love and the courage that made her refuse to abandon her beliefs and the care of her children, even when it cost her her life. So I think an extraordinary, ordinary person is what I need as an example.
Thank you. Question 2. For the people of faith in the 21st century, the notion of mission to the Jews in the 1930 Budapest may just sit a little uncomfortably. Can Jane's pre-war work inform interfaith relations today?
That is a very important question. I discovered that from the 19th century, mission to the Jews was very popular, particularly among evangelical churches in Western Europe and America. It was based on a particular theology that believed that return of the Jews to Palestine and recognition of the Christian faith would bring about the second coming of Christ. Many of the activities of the missions to the Jews were benevolent, certainly in intent, but I think we do have to ask the question of whether the very concept, in fact, implied a belief that Jews were somehow inferior that may have contributed to the climate that made possible the Holocaust. And certainly the Jewish authorities at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem at first turned down quite abruptly the first approach that was made to have Jane Haining recognized as righteous among the nations, because the aim of the mission had been to convert Jews. However, research, and Jane's story in particular, has, I think, revealed that, as we've seen, while she was deeply and appropriately rooted in her own faith, Jane's priority was never conversion, but simply to love and care for those with whom she worked, irrespective of religion. And I think that is certainly the approach that can best inform interfaith relations today. We come from our own place, but we come together in common humanity to try as best we can not to put obstacles in the way of meeting the needs of all.
Thank you. Question 3. In the book, the question is asked, why do we need her story today? Quite obviously we do. In what ways do you think we need and can employ Jane's story today?
We need the story simply to be able to tell it, because like all good stories, there's a transparency, a kind of self-evident character in Jane's story that I think says a great deal, and that anyone can understand. Interestingly, the response, how can we not need this story, that was made by somebody following a conversation with a young Muslim girl who had, I think, visited the Scottish Church in Budapest and heard a bit about Jane Haining and had asked, was Jane Haining a Jew? And when she heard the answer, no, she was not a Jew, the girl nodded and understood what that story was saying. And I think we need it for its transparency and its truth.
Mary, thank you for taking care to answer these questions very carefully. It's much appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, the subject of each lecture is considered at least 2 years in advance. We need to have the right subject, we need a good lecturer, and at the appropriate time. The other important point and ingredient is support. And we have had unstinting support from St Columba's and club member Ian Lindsay, a Majesty's ambassador to Hungary, who has made quite an impact in Budapest, learning to speak Hungarian as well as holding Burns suppers. How Robert Burns sounds in Hungarian, I'll be interested to hear. The Hungarian Embassy and Cultural Centre in London have also been extraordinarily helpful, supporting this lecture and providing the musicians. Therefore, it gives me great pleasure to introduce His Excellency Dr. Ferenc Kuman, Hungarian Ambassador to the UK, who arrived in London earlier this year to propose the vote of thanks. Dr. Kuman is a career diplomat who has held a number of senior positions in Europe and America and has been an advisor to the Prime Minister and Presidents of Hungary. But he's no dry civil servant, and in the short time I've known him, he has shown great commitment to the Jane Haining lecture. He also knows his Hungarian wines, for which we will serve at a Hungarian Scottish dinner next year when the restrictions allow. There are details in the lecture programme which is obtainable online. Dr. Kuman, may I invite you to propose the vote of thanks? Thank you.
Good evening, dear friends and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is my honor and privilege to be with you here at St Columba's Church in London. Though we cannot be physically together tonight due to our social distancing obligations, but thanks to technology, the organizers could overcome all rather significant obstacles And this particularly important lecture could eventually take place in the online sphere. Let me start by expressing my gratitude to our lecturer tonight, to Mary Miller. It is obvious that you have a unique relation to your heroine, to Jane Haining. Your work, your book, and your presentation about her reveals clearly that you are not just a distant observer. Your intention reveals clearly that you are not just willing to reconstruct the story of her life, but also to bring her drama close to your readers, to your audience, with lots of compassion, through deep understanding of her difficult choices. May I also underline how accurately you described the context of Jane Haining's tragedy. Even as a Hungarian, I couldn't explain the era any better. Discussing this period is certainly a difficult challenge for us Hungarians, as it is undoubtedly the darkest chapter of our country's history. Even from today, 2 generations after the horror of Holocaust, it is difficult not only for us, but for everyone, I suppose, to understand why it had to happen in Hungary. How come that we couldn't avoid it so close to the final defeat of the Nazi Germany? How come that we were incapable of saving our Jewish compatriots' lives so close to the end of the war? This incredibly complex historic heritage leaves us, the following generations, with hard and painful dilemmas. Why were there so many Hungarians ready to collaborate with the invading Nazi forces and help them to implement their evil plan of completing the genocide that already had killed millions by the time? Why were there even more Hungarians who were paralyzed, passively stood by, and did not help to the neighbors or even to their friends? And why were there so few who actively helped? Why were they foreigners, or at least the ones we know the most, like the diplomats Roh Wallenberg or Karl Lutz, or the fragile missionary Jane Haining herself? As in darkness we always find and celebrate the light, so emerges the story of Jane Haining, brought close to us by Mary Miller's thorough interpretation. As we heard, she has been posthumously honored by Yad Vashem's Righteous Among the Nations award, like the 867 Hungarians who also find some brave ways to help and who also received this prize. They were the beacons of hope. They are the ones we look at if we search for humanity in the most inhuman period of our modern history. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a lot to do to raise the awareness among Hungarians and probably elsewhere as well about the exceptional story of Jane Haining. I am proud to tell you that the Budapest Holocaust Memorial Center that was established by the first Orbán government in 1999 has a special exhibition in honor of the Scottish missionary. I am particularly grateful to Mary Miller that tonight we could also learn from the lecture that Annette Lantos, the wife of the late Congressman Tom Lantos, was among the Jewish pupils of the Scottish school. I met her for the first time when the Tom Lantos Institute was established in 2011 in Budapest with the support of the second Orbán government, and we worked together on several projects with her daughter, Katrina Lantos-Sweat. Let me also tell you how sorry I am that this time, due to the pandemic restrictions, the organizers had to deviate from the well-established tradition of the Caledonian Lectures, and tonight dinner will not follow the event. However, when conditions permit, it will take place with Scottish-Hungarian culinary highlights and with Hungarian wines, as we heard. To conclude, please allow me to thank the organizers, everyone at the Caledonian Club, especially David Kostri, for including the subject of Jane Haining in the Caledonian Lecture program. I hope that she will now be better known to many in the UK and as well as in Hungary. We have already some well-known, outstanding connections in our history, like the Hungarian origin St Margaret of Scotland, or the chief engineer of our beloved chain bridge in Budapest, the Scottish Adam Clark. Jane Haining must have a solid position among these heroes we both respect and honor. With that, let me introduce to you someone who also worked tirelessly in the last couple of years to bring closer our two nations, my dear colleague, who has just completed an extremely successful tenure in Budapest as Her Majesty's Ambassador. Please welcome Ian Lindsay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ferenc, for those kind words. And thank you, Mary, for a wonderful presentation this evening. Thank you, David, for coming up with the idea that Jane Haining would be a fitting subject for the Caledonian Lecture. Jane is very much worthy of this evening's lecture. A good woman, a good person, a Scottish heroine. As Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal says in her words in the programme this evening, Jane was an inspirational person. And I think it's fair to say that here in the United Kingdom, in Scotland and in Hungary, Jane Haining is now far better known for her bravery and her exceptional sacrifice. It is worth recalling that she is Scotland's only Holocaust hero, and she is one of only a handful of British Holocaust heroes who paid the ultimate price for their bravery and sacrifice. And I hope that this evening's lecture will help towards some sort of fitting permanent memorial to Jane in Scotland, given the nature of her bravery and her sacrifice. As Mary said in her presentation, there is a particular affinity between Hungary and Scotland. And I can certainly affirm to that after 4.5 wonderful years in Budapest as Her Majesty's Ambassador. As the Hungarian Ambassador has said, the oldest link is in fact that of St Margaret of Scotland, Scotland's only royal saint who was born in southern Hungary and married King Malcolm III. The oldest building indeed in Edinburgh Castle is the St Margaret Chapel. As the Ambassador also mentioned, the iconic chain bridge in Budapest was built by a Scottish engineer, Adam Clark, from Edinburgh. And let us not also forget, as we're here this evening in St Columba's Church, the 150-year-old connection between the New College in Edinburgh and the Debrecen Reformed Church College, which has been sending students to Edinburgh for a very long time. In summary, we've had a wonderful evening. It's been a wonderful presentation, and I thank all of those who have been involved. And I hope you'll be able to join us in person in the new year when we can come together and pay tribute to Jane Haining face-to-face and in person. Thank you all very much. Good night.